What's up, guys? Dr. Shepard here. Today we are going to be talking more about scrupulosity OCD, also sometimes referred to as religious or moral OCD. Before we get started, if you want to get a better idea of what OCD is and an overview of the different themes that we see in OCD, check out this video first. Remember that people can have a mixture of different OCD subtypes. So just because someone has a lot of scrupulosity OCD characteristics doesn't mean they don't also have some that fit in with the harm OCD subtype. It's more common for people to have a mixture of subtypes rather than just one. We are going to talk about scrupulosity OCD today, but there are so many others, so stay tuned and subscribe if you aren't already. Anytime we're talking about a psychiatric illness like this, we are talking about symptoms that are excessive and get in the way of your ability to function in your day-to-day life. So we are going to be talking about a lot of these characteristics taken to the extreme. So what is scrupulosity OCD? Well, scrupulosity OCD, also called moral or religious OCD, is a form of obsessive-compulsive disorder where people develop these excessive fears that they have done something wrong, that they have broken a religious rule, religious law, that they have behaved in a way that's immoral, that's blasphemous or sinful. They may get really worried about whether they've done something immoral or illegal or evil. Many of the people that we see with scrupulosity OCD have a more religious focus to their obsessions. So you don't necessarily have to be religious in order to have scrupulosity OCD, but it's very common that people are. People with this form of OCD sometimes worry that if they get treatment, they may lose their religion, and that's just not true. We actually see that people's religious beliefs and their spirituality is impaired by this form of OCD. They really can't make the spiritual connections or practice their religion as effectively as they would if they didn't suffer from this form of OCD. I think it's really interesting too that there are some very famous religious leaders from the past who are said to have potentially suffered from scrupulosity OCD. People like Saint Ignatius of Loyola and Martin Luther, for example. So having this form of OCD does not mean that you are not practicing your religion properly. It doesn't mean that you are not a religious person. It doesn't mean that you are an immoral person or that you're not spiritual. And on the flip side, getting treatment for this form of OCD doesn't mean that you will be less spiritual or less religious. Typically, we see people's connection with their religion or spirituality or even their own morality improve after treatment. So what does this actually look like? People with scrupulosity OCD may worry a lot about whether or not they are correctly interpreting their religious texts and whether they are adequately following the laws or rules or guidance of those religious texts. It's also common for people to worry a lot about the purity of their thoughts or whether a certain thought might mean that they are sinful or immoral or evil or not properly following their religion. A common example is someone having a sexual thought and thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe that that popped into my mind. I must not be as pure or as religious or as spiritual as I thought I was. They might have urges to yell or curse or do other inappropriate things during religious services. And they may also develop obsessions about certain symbols, numbers, or words. Okay, so as I mentioned, scrupulosity OCD typically takes the form of religious obsessions and compulsions, but you don't necessarily have to be religious to have this form of OCD. So some people just develop obsessions that they are immoral, that they're evil, that they may do something wrong, that they may have done something wrong in the past and not realized it. So for example, they might go back in their head and obsess over whether they did something that was unkind to someone else. Or maybe they realized that they gave incorrect information to someone. They might go back and replay that over and over in their head and try to figure out whether they might have done it intentionally and therefore are immoral or evil. People with scrupulosity OCD likewise can become excessively concerned that they might have offended someone. They may also worry a lot about the purchases they make, the things they do, and the things they wear, and whether or not those things are ethical. They might go to an extreme trying to figure out whether what they're wearing, eating, using, whatever is ethical or moral. And again, a lot of people do worry about whether or not what they eat, for example, is ethically sourced. And that's really important for a lot of people and isn't necessarily OCD. What makes it OCD is when people become so concerned with that that they really can't function. Sometimes people with scrupulosity OCD will worry about whether they have done something that is wasteful. For example, worrying a lot about wasting water or electricity and whether or not that makes them a bad person if they did. They may just become concerned about the idea of whether or not they're a good person and trying to figure out whether they are good or evil and what that means for them. So we've already touched on some of the ways that people with scrupulosity OCD try to calm some of these fears and obsessions. We talked about excessively sort of mentally checking or reviewing the things that you've done to make sure that they don't cross some moral line or some religious boundary that is important to you. Doing that sort of excessive checking or even reassuring yourself mentally, no, I am a good person. I know that I meant right by that. I know that I didn't do it intentionally, or I know that this clothing that I have is ethically sourced from a country with good labor practices. All of that sort of self-reassurance and checking is called a mental compulsion. And people with scrupulosity OCD, like other forms of OCD, engage in a lot of different mental compulsions. Others that we see commonly are counting, praying, repeating words and phrases over and over again. People with scrupulosity OCD might engage in mental compulsions like giving themselves hypothetical situations to test their morality or their religious beliefs. So for example, thinking, okay, what would I do if someone came up to me who I was very attracted to and they asked me to go to lunch with them? Would I take that person up on that offer? And if I did, would that mean that I was a bad partner to my current partner? Confession is a normal part of many religious practices, but people with scrupulosity OCD will take it to the extreme. They may feel the urge to confess every tiny thing that they can think of, and even things they're not sure whether they actually did. And they may not just confess to religious leaders in religious settings, they may confess to anyone who can listen and reassure them that they aren't a bad person. People with scrupulosity OCD might also avoid situations where they feel like their morality or their religion may be tested, and they may take this again to the extreme. Some people with scrupulosity OCD actually can't go to religious services anymore because they're so afraid of the kinds of thoughts they might have. People with scrupulosity OCD may also do things like punish themselves for the things that they feel they've done wrong. And if they're concerned about things like wasting resources or whether or not something is ethical or moral that they are using, they may go to great lengths to excessively check. And even if they find out, this item of clothing has been ethically sourced, or no, I didn't waste that much water, they may not be reassured by that, and they may have to check over and over again. Like any other form of OCD, all of these compulsions can provide a temporary relief from the obsessions that the person experiences, but before long, the obsessions return with intensity, and they have to go right back to performing the compulsions. That's where that OCD loop really kicks in. If you notice these patterns of thinking in yourself, it may be a sign of OCD. What it's not is a sign that you are a bad person. So don't listen to your OCD when it tries to convince you of that. Instead, I really encourage you to see a mental health professional who can help guide you through this. If you want to read more about this form of OCD and others, check out my blog post on the subject. You can also stay tuned for more videos on the different subtypes of OCD and how we treat them. If you like this video, please hit like, leave me a comment, and hit subscribe if you aren't already. That helps me to know that this is the kind of information that's important to you, and I'll keep making it.